Tom was very kind to accept our invitation. Tom has been working very much on anything that deals with environment, but as we all know, all those problems like in the just transition of the European Commission, fair and equitable society, social, green, sustainability, it all comes together and is intertwined. Tom, if I'm not mistaken, you were also a little bit behind the screens, but supporting Greta Thunberg in her entire journey. So I leave the floor to you to share your ideas with all of us. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and thank you all for the invite. And it was great actually to hear that last kind of 20 minutes of presentations, because I was not that familiar with the work of the EPA before, and it's really impressive to see all of this great work and great thinking coming together. So, as Stephen said, I'm the Communications Director of the European Climate Foundation. I have been for 11 years, I realized the day before yesterday. And I play a lot of different roles in the climate community. In that capacity, it probably doesn't quite paint the full picture. But I was very kindly invited to talk to you about the 2020s, about the next 10 years, and just to kind of fire off some ideas and some thoughts, which I hope might help your thinking. Just to be clear up front, I will keep this pretty brief. I'm going to jump through these slides. I'm very happy to take questions. It's not a wildly rosy picture, so just to kind of put that out there up front. And the point here is, I think, the subhead here, which is why the 2020s are the most important decade in history. And I stand by that statement, and I'll explain it. We came, as Stephen said, we've done a lot of work with Greta and the school strikers, and that was a really interesting development in 2019, and it really felt like a new kind of energy in the movement, and a new level of generational awareness about the problems and about, obviously, climate specifically, but also starting to have that kind of wider generational justice conversation, and bringing a lot of these different issues that you are thinking about as social entrepreneurs into that similar conversation. And it was, obviously, she brought a new voice and a new perspective, and held a very interesting mirror up to both the climate community itself and the climate cause, in terms of this very, very sharp focus that she's had throughout on the science. It's the science is what's meaningful, the facts are here. And essentially, I think she's very right. I think the climate movement has learned a lot more from Greta Thunberg than Greta Thunberg has learned from the climate movement, to be frank. She's very smart. And I think that there's a really important lesson there, and that's what I'm gonna come through. We also came out of into the 2020s with a very, very active conversation about climate change. A huge impact of the United Nations IPCC 1.5 degrees report that was released in November 2018. That had a very, very long tail. Again, worked on a lot of the communications around that, and it really has changed the conversation and created the kind of space in which Greta Thunberg's voice came to the fore, but also many others. And it felt, coming into the 2020s, like a moment where really the world was about to start taking this seriously. The COP in London, we had a whole bunch of interesting developments. The conversation had really started to move. We're starting to hear very, very different noises and different kind of narrative coming out of industry around the climate issue, and also more of a coming together of different elements, particularly of civil society, around joining up climate issues with social issues, with issues of equity, responsible capitalism, those kinds of pieces coming in together. Then this happened. And it's very, very interesting to look at the impacts of COVID on how the whole debate has gone. And clearly that impact is live. And so it's very difficult to make any sort of future predictions about how any of this is going to play out. And we're all obviously on this call because we're experiencing this right now. But what is clear is we know quite a lot about massive economic crises because they've happened before. Now, this is different, and it has very many different factors. And obviously it's a public health crisis as well as an economics crisis. So there's there's a lot of different factors here. So I don't want to paint a picture that somehow, we can predict the future from this. But what we do know is that a major crisis, if you take 2008 as an example, defines the decade that follows it to a very, very significant degree. And the 2008 crisis defined the decade following it, politically, economically, socially, in many, many, many different ways. And we've seen an increase in inequality in that period, sparked in many ways by that crisis, which has changed the politics and changed the political space in which we work, changed the societal space in which we work, and I would argue made it a lot more challenging. It's very clear that the response to COVID, one way or another, will either be an we're all in this together response, or it will be a everyone for themselves response. And the difference between those two things essentially settles a great deal of what we have to cope with in terms of the omni crisis, as we've started calling it, which is coming down the road towards us. However, and I think this is where my job comes into this, I do believe that if you can change the conversation, you can change the world. And what's really interesting about the impact of COVID, and we're doing a huge amount of message testing and audience research all over the world, not just in Europe. And what we're seeing is that people's conversations are changing. And the way that people think about the role of the government, the role of capital, what are real priorities in their lives, how do they feel about their communities, how do they feel about people in other countries, all of these things are very, very much in play in a way that they haven't been for a very long time. And that's a very different, we're finding you can change conversations in some very particular ways. Now that can be for good, that can also be bad, and I'll come to that. Now I'm hoping this is going to work, but can you see on your screen right now an animation happening? Yes, good. Okay, I can see Stephen nodding. So if we'd peaked global CO2 emissions in 2000, we'd be reducing CO2 at about 5% a year, and that would seem pretty doable. We didn't, obviously. They continued to rise. If you peaked global emissions in 2019, you've got to start to bring that down at 15% a year, right? We haven't yet peaked global emissions. And it's starting to get really hard. The 1.5 C carbon budget, i.e. the amount of carbon we can still put in the atmosphere and have a shot at limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, will be used up in 8 years on current trajectories. So that's before 2030. This is the decade, essentially, in which humanity either gets its arms around the climate problem or the climate problem gets its arms around us. And this stops being a mitigation fight at that point. It becomes an adaptation fight. And that's a very, very, very different set of circumstances. That essentially is why the 2020s are the most important decade in history, because this is it. We can't fight with the physics, sadly. We're right up against this particular problem. And COVID, sadly, has not made that go away. There has been a very, very fast and quite significant reduction in global emissions, as you may have read the many papers that the community's been working on, looking at this issue. The problem is, of course, those emissions reductions due to COVID have been done in an entirely unsustainable way. And what we're seeing is, for example, if you look at air pollution as a symbol, as an indicator of this, air pollution issues are back to where they were pre-COVID in Beijing now. And we're seeing exactly the same trajectory in pretty much every other country that's starting to lift its lockdown, Australia, others. All of those emissions are just ramping back up because essentially people just stopped moving and now they're starting to move again. So they haven't happened in the way that you'd actually need society to decarbonize to have a shot at 1.5. Sorry, I put that stationary slide in case the animation didn't work. Again, just to put that into human terms and what that actually means. So if you look at current trajectory, so assume we don't make some kind of miracle change and that essentially predicted emissions, assuming all the regulations and all the targets that are currently in place are achieved, but we keep going on the track that we're on, by somewhere in the late 2040s, 2050s, you start to get some really, really interesting developments. Now, the black spots on this chart in front of you that essentially are in, well, the Sahara, in fact, geography can probably point to this. So essentially, those little black, solid black pieces are places in the world that currently experience annual average temperatures above 30 degrees and top out somewhere in the 60s. They are in the Sahara. Nobody lives there, right? You get humans do pass through those places in the world. That does happen, but nobody lives there. It's a level of unlivable heat that happens in those places. You will find that the striped black pieces are the regions of the world in which that heat will apply sometime in the 2050s. It's difficult to put an actual date on it, assuming we continue on the current pathway. Now, so you're looking at the whole of the northern part of South America. That includes the Amazon rainforest, just to be clear. Trees can't survive that level of heat. Contains essentially the whole of that piece of mid-Africa, but also look at India and all the way over into very significant parts of Asia. That whole section of the earth, which would then be subject to, as we said, an unlivable level of heat, is currently home to 3.5 billion people who live in that space. Not to say the ecosystem impacts, the wildlife, the biodiversity, all of the other connected things. And this is not, 100 years away. This happens mid-century. And this is starting to happen now. As we know, you're starting to get crop failures. These areas are starting to expand. Ignore this next bubble. But one of the interesting elements, I was talking to some people about this. So if you take, people were saying, well, what are the actual impacts on, the wider world? Well, you've got obviously mass movement of those people. Where are they going to go? All of those questions. But things like, for example, cotton. That's where all the cotton in the world is. There's very substantial amounts of wheat. Take any commodity. There's a huge amount of it produced in these regions of the world, which are no longer going to be able to sustain those. It's a really, really significant problem. That's the point I made about the Amazon. Now, what's interesting is we are obviously making changes, right? There's a lot of changes happening. Coal has taken an absolute kicking in the last few years and continues to do so. And COVID has driven that actually harder. We're seeing as energy demand has dropped, it's fossil fuel energy, which is predominantly borne the brunt of that, and primarily coal. So there's a lot of coal that's come off the system. There's a lot of new coal infrastructure investment, which has been abandoned. And that's great. Coal off the system is all good news. Gas continues to grow pretty effectively. That's a really, really significant issue. In terms of its climate impact, I mean, everyone always talks about how, gas is a bridging fuel, whatever, it's not as bad as coal. Well, yeah, but it's still a heck of a lot worse than most other things. And so it has become a huge climate problem. And if you look at the scale of investments that are going from banks into infrastructure around the world, huge amounts of that are going into new gas infrastructure right now. LNG, natural gas, and various others. All of that essentially has to come off the system. So that's a significant issue. But as you can see from this chart, we're getting, the rise in solar is absolutely astonishing. Rise in wind is astonishing. We're getting increases in hydro. That's all great news. But those curves have to really, really ramp and continue to ramp really hard. So I think one of the interesting opportunities of the COVID crisis, partly because obviously you'll have seen that moment when West Texas intermediate oil prices went negative. The fossil fuel industry is in pretty bad shape. Producing fossil fuels right now is not a very profitable business. It's a good time to stop. And that obviously is not just about corporate actors, it's also about state actors to a very significant degree. Implications for the Russian economy, implications for the Saudi economy, et cetera, et cetera. These are massive questions, but as these crises kind of focus us in and give us a very, very clear shape of the next 10 years, it's worth thinking about those things in some detail. And when we talk about different kind of dynamics, when you start to combine these various crises that we're facing, this is from the IEA, the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook in 2019, the new one's about to come out. And obviously, in terms of the rise in CO2 emissions between 2010 and 2018, the massive majority of that was power. And so that's why I'm saying coal and gas are absolutely fundamental to getting us to a point where we can solve this problem. But then you see this red block here, this huge rise in SUVs. Whereas in fact, if you look at other cars off at the right-hand end there, emissions from other types of passenger transport basically have actually fallen. But SUVs are a massive problem because they're driving up. They're driving up overall transport emissions. Now, this was pre-COVID, and again, what we see is if you look at the German recovery package that was announced this morning, it's a great package. I've got to say, I'm really actually impressed, which is unusual. I tend to be pretty pessimistic about these things, but it's a really impressive package. And the key thing that the German government have done, because obviously car makers are a really big deal in Germany and a big part of their economy, they have not put in place a scrappage scheme which essentially pays people for, or essentially serves as a subsidy for further diesel and petrol cars. What they've done is we're just going to fully incentivize the going electric. We're not going to give any help to the dirty side of the transition. We're going to fully focus on the clean side of the transition. And that's a really, really big statement. And it starts to show that the massive bet made by Volkswagen in the fallout from their Dieselgate scandal is starting to pay off, and that's starting to make sense. So I think, for example, this crisis accelerates that kind of trend that we're going to see. We're going to see the move to electric in mobility faster than we otherwise would. Power continues to be a problem. Aviation, massive issue, but we've just massively reduced passenger numbers. So again, like, are there ways that we can think about taking this moment to make the recovery more sustainable? And what's interesting is when you look at public opinion on this issue, which is kind of my bag, and obviously this is across countries, this from all over the world, and you're seeing agreement with the statement, government actions should prioritize climate change in the economic recovery after COVID-19 in the 60s, 70s, even 80s across the world. 81% in India. You've not got an 81% consensus in India on pretty much anything. I mean, these are incredible numbers. And that's a really, really good picture. Now, does it stick around? Does that kind of sentiment hold as the sheer scale of the economic fallout of the COVID crisis becomes clear? I think we're all held slightly in suspended animation while in lockdown. As we come blinking back out into the sunlight, it is going to become clear, as we know, right? There's 40 million unemployed people in the US. We don't really know what those numbers are for Europe yet, and quite how bad this is going to get. When it becomes clear what that fallout is, will that drive the sentiment down? Difficult to know. But the fact that it's there is really good, and it seems to be holding up so far, even as we start to come out of lockdown. Things we're going to have to think about out of this. We need to start meeting people where they are much more. It is clear that the last 10 years have done a lot of damage to a lot of societies. We see huge splits, we see huge inequality, we see the politics playing out of that inequality. We're going to have to get much, much better at not just talking to the base. And I think that's a real lesson for the climate community, but it's a lesson for those socially concerned across the piece. You've got to go and find the people where they are and understand their perspectives. The forgotten elements of society are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's going to be a significant problem we need to think about. Everything's digital. We've got to win the internet. And that is an absolute fact. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Disinformation is a really, really key part of that. It's becoming a massive issue. The social contract piece of this, I mean, I think this is particularly true in Europe. It's true everywhere, but there's an interesting European view on this, which is that if you look at the detail behind the Commission's recovery package that they've put out, actually the green and social pieces of it are very, very light. And it's very, very easy for member states to get away with getting that money and essentially spending it in ways which don't really conform to the headlines of that agenda. and not really get punished for it. We've got to get a new social contract which works for all of the people. We've got to get over the East-West divide in Europe. It's absolutely fundamental to any kind of progress, but that also exists within countries, and we've got to think about that too. And the North-South divide that broke over COVID economics and the Corona bonds conversation, I mean, obviously that way madness lies. And so getting that social contract back in place and people to believe in a social contract with their government again, and with state actors and non-state actors like yourselves, is absolutely fundamental. We've got to use this to crush emissions. We have to have, in this decade, absolute emissions reductions. Flatlining will not do. You know, we can't just slow growth. We've actually got to peak and start to go down considerably. We've still not done that. Since 1850, CO2 emissions have grown every year, and they will grow again. They will increase in 2020. They will increase a lot more slowly than we thought they were going to, but they will still increase. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere will increase. And empowering the brave. I think that's another absolutely fundamental thing, is that state actors, non-state actors who are doing the right thing need to be sung from the rooftops. Good examples, we've got to get out there. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to rip through the rest of this really quickly. In fact, I'll skip that slide entirely and just explain this. If you look at the digital news space in 2019, so what we did was we did an analysis of all of the news stories about climate, and not just news stories about climate related to it, shared on Facebook in the world in English. Okay, that was it's a rough take, but this is what we did. And what we found was that the most shared piece on Facebook relating to climate in 2019 had the headline, "NASA admits climate change is caused by the sun." Right? Now, obviously, note to self, that's not true. Okay, so just making that point very clearly. So it was a piece of fake news. NASA never admitted any such thing. It went out there. It's not the first time that's happened. That was a fake news article. Also led climate coverage on Facebook in 2018 and in 2017. There were different articles, but that's where that is. So just to know, there are a lot of people making money off this stuff, and they continue to do it. But numbers 2, 3, and 5 were all about planting trees, and why planting trees is good for the climate, and indeed it actually is a potential solution to climate change. The Trillion Trees Initiative out of the WEF, and various other elements of that. And we thought that was interesting because planting trees obviously is good. Planting trees is great. It's not a solution to climate change, but it's a good thing to do. It's an environmentally solid thing to do. You can't keep producing emissions and just plant trees and think it's going to fix it. That will not work. Planting trees will help, but only in a very serious mitigation scenario. So why were all those articles out there being shared about planting trees? Well, mainly because there were massive social media budgets being spent to drive the narrative online that planting millions of trees was really good for the environment. And they were being spent by Eni, Equinor, and Shell, primarily, obviously, who were all very large oil and gas companies. Why? Well, I mean, I don't need to go into the obvious whys and wherefores here. But what is clear is there is still a vast amount of greenwashing going on, right? There is still a vast amount of misinformation and active disinformation in this conversation. And as COVID has driven, again, the last bits of our lives that were not digital are now digital, right? And so this is the information space in which we operate, and it is a divided information space. We do not have a public square anymore, right? We have, this is what I call the two cities effect, right? And I've used Anglophone examples here, so my apologies. But what you find is that people have come to live in information ecosystems. And some of those information ecosystems still include sources of news, maybe in an ecosystem which entirely reinforces that person's particular set of beliefs, but at least some source of news. Many of them don't contain any sources of news at all anymore. And they're basically entirely driven by social media content from the social networks that those people have built up around them. And they're not watching the BBC or etc. Now, again, this has been really interesting impact of COVID is the role of mainstream media has increased. in the public discourse. People have turned to what they perceive to be trusted sources because there is so much misinformation. I mean, the numbers are staggering on the amount of misinformation. 25% of people in most countries that we can find survey data for, at least 25%, are under the impression that COVID-19 was developed in a lab in China. And that is obviously not true, right? It has even been investigated and been proven not to be true. And yet these are enormous numbers. It's about a third of the US, which currently believes that to be true. This is a huge issue. And while we have a public discourse based on misinformation, we will continue to lose across the piece. You can't build social cohesion on lies. It doesn't work, right? And we're going to need that social cohesion moving forward as we have to deal with all these massive problems. So this is a really, really key one. I'm absolutely convinced if we don't win the information war, we won't win the climate war. And I'm going to wrap up because I've gone on a bit. But as I said, I've been doing this for 11 years. Let's call it a decade for rounding up. And I have had a great deal, I've worked across the world developing communications infrastructure for the climate cause in that time, and worked with a lot of brilliant and amazing people. And there's a few things that I took away from it, which I thought might be useful to this group as you think about it as from a philanthropy and from an impact perspective. One, we will not win because we are right. We will win because we are organized. We spend a lot of money trying to be more right. And I think we need to get over ourselves on that point and understand that you need infrastructure to drive change. You need to build change. People will not believe you just because you are right. You have to meet them where they are. Good policy does not adopt itself. It is about politics. It matters who's in power. And if you want to make change in the world, you've got to think about that, and you've got to become engaged. This is a political fight at the end of the day, right? It has in many parts of the world been turned actually into a straight out culture war. You want to make social change, you're going to have to take that into account. You're going to have to get our hands dirty and get involved. Don't mistake access for influence. We need to make sure that we are using, all of us who are in privileged positions of power, we are using that influence in a really, really effective way. Just being invited into the meeting is not enough. We've got to understand that we play a part in an ecosystem of change, and we've got to work with all the other actors to be part of that. Political battles don't end. And I mean, we've learned this in the climate movement the hard way, right? We thought we had it down on the science. In 2009, an attack was launched on the science. It took us till 2015 to basically finish it. And it still comes back at us every time. Those kind of battles don't end. You've got to build defenses and not just assume that progress is linear. You could argue that the same is happening with democracy in America right now. Too many assumptions that somehow it was unassailable and it could survive even the worst of times. We're literally potentially seeing the beginning of the American Civil War. We often don't behave like we have an opposition. It's not true in the climate space. We do. We have an active opposition. And it's quite committed and it's pretty well resourced, and they're not giving up. We see an increase in online ad spend on misinformation over the course of the last year. So we need to take that into account. We need to think about that and understand it. And we need to make sure that we're making it clear that we understand where the lines are. I think I can probably sum these up into one shot, which is, I think it's really important to understand all of our respective parts in that ecosystem of change, right? It's not a series of projects. It's not a series of one-offs, right? It's all part of a step. And I think understanding that wider context of our operating environment is super, super important. And we need to act like we're in a crisis, because we really, really are, right? The existential catastrophe that faces us is very, very real, right? And it's basically this decade. This is the one we've got. And so I think there's a level of energy and focus, which I could hear in the presentations that preceded this one, which is great. And we've really got to keep that up and keep that focused. And I think the last thing, and I think this was also kind of alluded to, we can allow institutional approaches to get in the way of our primary objectives. And I think that's a real challenge for a lot of people. And I'm very lucky in that I have a lot of free space to operate inside the European Climate Foundation. I get, I access a lot of spaces that are way, way, way beyond the limits of that institution, and I can do that pretty flexibly. And I know that's more difficult in other institutional contexts, but I do think it's an incredibly important point that keeping our eye on the prize is a really, really important part of this, because essentially, as they say, if we don't win this one, we lose everything else. And so that's a key element going forward. I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Tom. And I can see many people stay online. So it has been a very intriguing presentation. Same time, I want to be conscious of time as well. So I will take 2 questions. And if you could quickly share your ideas. Some people were also asking your slides, and we're recording this. So offline, we will ask your consent to share this video and or slides. We can take that offline. So I want to stop in 5 minutes, literally. So 2-3 minutes per question. One question is, how can we make sure that behavior really changes after COVID? What type of measures are needed to ensure long-term change?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, look, there's 2 things that the emissions reduction due to the COVID crisis has really held out. One of which is that there's a significant portion of emissions which are driven by our daily lives. But the second one is it's not actually that much. There was about a 15% drop, right? And we stopped the global economy. We literally put the whole thing pretty much on hold, right? For a couple of months there. And when you look at it in that context, the impact was really not that massive. And I think that's really worth reflecting on. And what it shows is that the big pieces of this, in terms of the power infrastructure, in terms of how industry emissions are produced, etc. I mean, that really is the crunch point. Like, we've got to get coal and gas off the system. Like, that's the end of it, right? We've got to stop driving ICEs. A lot of that is about what's available, right? And so, state actors, in terms of how they're looking at the recovery, need to be investing in those fundamental changes in infrastructure, in the infrastructure of our lives, that are going to make those massive shifts. Now, what you can also do, sorry, go on.
Yeah, let's build on this to the second question.
Okay.
We can very much work on shifting from SUVs to electric cars, but then again, should we not fight the way we get around on the planet, or mobility? Is that not the main issue, rather than fighting the shifting cars?
Right, and so that's a really fundamental one, right? And so the really key pieces here are shipping and aviation, right, which are absolutely enormous. And you've got to think about how, I mean, what we've all discovered is that it turns out we can do a lot of our work and we can do a lot of our interactions without getting on a plane. And I think one of the key, in terms of behavior change, how you start to lock this in, is about narrative, right? It's about taking hold of that sentiment that somehow things cannot go back to how they were, and start weaving narratives around a better world, around a better recovery, around how this works for people. And I think that is essentially how you lock in some of this behavior change, is make sure that we are not trying to get back to where we were. But that's going to involve a lot of narrative change in people's heads, because one's natural state, obviously, as humans is, make change stop, right? Maintain the status quo. But the status quo is killing us. And so I think it's about changing the conversation around what we want the status quo to be. And I think COVID has taught us a lot in terms of people valuing community, in people thinking local. You look at online debates or media debates, right? They've become incredibly national. That's a good thing in some ways, because people are thinking local, but it also is a bad thing, because there's almost no coverage in the European press of the impacts of COVID in Africa, for example. Very, very, very tiny amounts. You'd usually expect development issues to be much further up the agenda, and they've just been squeezed out. So we're going to have to think about how we tell stories and how we frame those ideas about how we can get out of this and make it better. But a lot of it is going to be, indeed, cities need to be pedestrianized, right? We need to be getting rid of the cars. We need to be getting people on bikes. We need to be getting people walking again. We need to change their diets. And that kind of elements are really community driven.
Thank you so much, Tom. I feel so sorry to push you a bit. I'm sure many people will rehear what you've been saying and sharing with us for this very timely insights and this call to action. At least for myself, bringing back again that it's money, yes, but it's also the narrative and shifting people's minds is a great insight. I definitely take away. I would like to thank you so much. Sorry for the overrun. Also, big sorry to all of you, and great to many of you that stayed online. It's our first online AGM, so I think it was nice to have you all. Felipe, I don't know whether you want to formally conclude or you leave it like this.
I think we are already past our time. It was wonderful to meet virtually so many of the members. And also thank you, Tom, for a very inspiring talk that urges us for action. There's many things that we need to do on many fronts, but we are here as a community to work hard on making the world a better place for everyone. And so with these mandates, I thank you all for being with us today for this AGM. And the work will continue and even be more important as we move forward. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you, everyone. And on my side, I will kind of announce that the AGM and the meeting is closed, and wish you all to stay safe and work hard for impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the invite. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.